Anyone?
I don't think they're out to get me yet.
Question, discussion? You're going to have to use the mic if you have a question because it's the only way to capture people's voices.
Okay. I have a practical
Thanks, Miguel.
You mentioned a lot of resources that you have looked at and recommended. Is there any way we can write those down, like post them or something?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, because
So,
it's great.
I'm more than happy to be able to, once I have my website up, I'll have some more
Okay.
information, but I'm more than happy to be able to write up some of the things that I know. In the caregiver guide, there's also in the back quite a lot of resources that you can be able to find. The other really good resource is if you connect with any of a community hospice agency, then they also can give you a lot. And the truth is that while there's specific resources for hospice palliative care, you know, any of the old spiritual religions, you know, any of those have already knowledge inside of themselves around death and dying and different rites and rituals and how to be with and how to care for and all those different things. So if you're looking for more what's in the mainstream, then I can certainly be able to give you some of the ones that I love. They'll be skewed by what I like to read about.
Absolutely, and that's what I was looking for because you gave us a context and say, you're talking about this, and it touched me, and they said, where you can find more information about that was, or this person said that. So I was really interested in those.
I'm hoping that one of the things I'll be able to do is actually to write some of the stories and some of the experiences that I've had, because one of the real impact for me has been the stories. That's oftentimes for people who are with people who are dying. It's one of the best ways that you actually learn, is not from a book or from a theory, but actually being with. And it's very impactful. It's uncertain, but it's very impactful in that way. And those are the kinds of stories that I think are really great to be able to share. Those are the things that are meaningful, because they don't come from an intellectual perspective, but they come from the reality of what is. And those are really good. The other is that in North America, there's also a study, a field of study called Thanatology. And so it's the field around all things related to death, dying, loss, and bereavement. Not only about physical death, but it's also looking at how do people in modern world construct worldviews around death and dying. You know, what happens when you have a person who may have been raised with a certain religion and certain worldviews about death, afterlife, but what happens when they're exposed to a number of different cultures? What happens if they marry or get together with someone from a different culture? How does that really shape? How does the media, and I would say that right now the media has a very particular way of shaping how we look at death, very traumatic, as I said, but it can also allow us to be able to have other ways to be able to view death and dying. There are documentaries that are coming out that are looking at, you know, the variety of different ways to be able to be with dying. So there's lots out there. So thanatology is rich with knowledge and information around all of those different things, you know, from how we slaughter animals to the sacredness of the sacred and the sustainability of relationships after death. Anyone else?
I would be interested in resources about palliative care and hospices for people that are actually alone. So there are many immigrants or people that maybe they come, it's true, and they lost one spouse, or they may have no children, or single people. What are the resources to support them when they are at the end of their days, so that they do not end up as wards of the state? And you know.
So I know from, again, I can only speak from my knowledge and what I have experienced, is that many of the community hospice agencies have visiting programs where they have volunteers who have training in how to hold a presence and be with folks that are dying, and will go and visit. So they'll volunteer and be able to visit with someone. I think we do the best that we can in our medical system to be able to provide the nursing care for someone who's alone, but it's becoming more and more apparent that there are what I like to call orphan seniors sometimes. And those are folks who are getting older, and they might have had somebody who they assigned as their substitute decision maker because they didn't have family. And all of a sudden, their friend has died or fallen ill, and now they don't have anyone. And so that's sometimes where we find ourselves in our society, is to be able to say, how are we going to care for folks when they don't have 7, 6 children? We are very nomadic and we move. Most of the areas that people live are in the big cities. Well, what happens to the folks that are out in the country? How do we care for them? How do we be with them when they're dying? How do we provide that kind of support? Because dying is not a medical condition, it's a social condition, and it requires social solutions. So one of the really interesting things is there's this movement to be able to encourage people to build compassionate communities. And so those are volunteer organizations, oftentimes will start as hospice community agencies, who have a different way of how to build compassion, how to interconnect housing, food, all of those different things. What are all of the different components outside of our medical system that can help support someone who might be alone, who might be isolated, who may not have any family, or maybe somebody who's new to the country and doesn't quite know the resources that they have. So I don't have specifics, and it would all depend on, unfortunately at this point, it all depends on where you live and what might be available. But I'm hopeful that some of these new things are coming out and will help. I oftentimes get frustrated because I don't think it's happening fast enough.
With the aging population that we have, it definitely doesn't. Because I was thinking, if I want to prepare for my end of life,
Yeah.
I might as well start now. I would like to go and visit hospices. I would
Yes.
like to know where I find them.
Yes.
How do I get there so I can put it in my living will or end of care planning?
For sure.
If possible, I want to be taken to that place.
So again, that's a great first step, is find out where would I, right? And then be able to find some of the things that are appropriate or are legally related to Ontario. We don't have a living will in Ontario. We have advanced care planning where you know your values and wishes, but those are all good first steps. And again, the Caregiver's Guide has some of that information. But I mean, why not? Why not go visit a hospice and see, oh, this is really nice. I like this.
Go window shopping.
Yeah, a little bit.
Is it a 3-star or 2-star?
Yeah, I don't know. There are some that are, I had a friend who not too long ago died and was brought to a hospice, to a residential hospice. And part of it was because it was difficult. We don't oftentimes ask people, where would you like to do your dying? And where do you want to die? And sometimes there was 2 different questions. And so my friend was dying at home and was going to die in a residential hospice. And it was a place that was very inclusive to all kinds of worldviews, to all kinds of religions. She was able to marry together that which is familiar to her family and to her partner, and that's something that was what she would consider her worldview. And was able to have very simple things, realized in the last days of her life. And one of them was just to be able to be outside and feel the rain on her face. That's it. Very simple. I don't know if she would be able to have that if she was in a hospital. I hope so. It's not always the place. Sometimes it's the people. I'm not sure if it was Dr. Belford Mond, who was sort of the grandfather of palliative care in Canada. But one palliative care doctor once says, if the beauty cannot be in the space that you create, whether it be the room or the building, then you be the beauty. You bring in that. It's your attitude, your approach, how you hold the person in that time.
Do you have any thoughts on how mortality salience or death awareness might lead to hedonism or consumerism? And related to that is, the huge donations that the head of Microsoft and Facebook have made. My understanding is that has to do with wanting that sense of permanence because of an awareness of death. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering what the effects of that are, because that would just suggest that people who are rich have greater permanence.
Mm-hmm. So I think with again, my perception, what I come to know, is there are things in our world that have a neutrality to them, right? Fire, water, wind. Those, some of those things are very neutral. It depends on humans as their will and their decision as to what they do with it. And I would say that birth and death are very similar in that. And what I mean is that we can hold death as a transition and as sacred and as the right of every single living thing to be able to honor it that way. Or in the choices that we make, we create enterprises around that. I think that, as an example, funeral homes served a very valuable purpose. Is if you go back in history, and again, it's from my own awareness, is they were created because there was a lot of infection and a lot of disease and things that were exposed people to get ill, influenza, those kinds of things. So how do you contain an illness and death in that way? And so funeral homes were created out of that to be able to take the bodies in and to care for it and so on and so forth. And that's valid, and I think there's lots of great things that have come out of, again, health and safety in relationship to that. But it may have gone a little bit too far, where we have lost the ability, and this is where some of the movements that are happening, like death midwifery, wants to bring back some of those rights, to enable to people, ordinary people, to take care of the folks who die with them, because they're not always going to be loved ones, family, and again, it's those different relationships, but how to be able to care for them at home, how to prepare the body without embalming fluid, without any of those kind of things, if that's what they choose, and how to empower to be able to do that. So we always have to be aware, right? And even I think, even for me, I need to be aware in my own desire to bring death education out, to not cross a line, to always invite people, to let them know. I mean, it is in the Association of Death Educators and Counselors that comes from the States, has scope of practice and have ethics. And one of the things it talks about is you need to let people know that it might bring up certain things. It might bring up memories and uncomfortable feelings. And you have to let people know that so that they have that level of awareness. So I think we can cross the lines. I think one of the things, and I talked a little bit about this, I have a concern about the most popular YouTube video that people watch around death and dying. And there is, when we know this from psychology and from literature, that there comes a point where when you see so much of the horrible death and the traumas and the terror, that you become desensitized. That you, as a way of protecting yourself, separate from that. In psychology, and again, Belfort Mont talked a little bit about this at a conference I was at. Inside of our unconscious, we have a place where we feel a sense of connection, a sense of things making sense. That we feel that we have meaning in our life, that there is something greater than us and that it is connected. There is a part of us that have that. If you meditate and if you have a spiritual practice, you have more access to that part of inside of your mind that holds that awareness. And then we also have death anxiety, right? Remember I talked about the insatiable will to live, and sometimes it's out of that. But that sometimes grows because it gets fed when we don't talk about death, when we traumatize or we put out those images of horrible deaths. And that grows a little bit. And so that is a fear and something that we resist and fight against. And it sometimes closes off that greater awareness, right? So there is a risk that in what is happening right now is creating more and more fear in people, and that they become less and less having the ability to see that interconnection and to have that awareness. And so most folks, talk about spiritual practice. We talk about mindfulness. We talk about awareness, because that is oftentimes what we need in order to be able to decrease some of the trauma of that death anxiety that we have, and to see death for what it is, the opposite of birth and the transition and a part of life.
Thanks. I was wondering if there was a moment or a specific insight that you could share with us that made you decide to become a death educator.
I had a conversation with a person who developed the virtual school for death midwifery in Canada, and Cassandra said, you know, where did this all begin for you? And I said, that's a really good question, and I'm not quite sure, because I think I had a level of awareness when I was about 25 or so. And remember, I was talking about being in the long-term care home and caring for folks who were dying and how ill-prepared I was. And I think that was my very first awareness, where I realized that although I had lots of training as a nurse, I was not prepared. I didn't know how to be with this person who was dying. I was awkward. All I wanted to do was to be able to be as close to them as I could, and I wasn't quite sure, you know, professional conduct and those kinds of things. And I think that was my first awareness that I had, that I really wanted to know more. As much as I was scared in the moment and I was uncertain, I really wanted to know more. But if I was to go back even before then, I went to a very small high school, and we probably had a death every single year, different kinds of deaths. Our school was very small, and folks were really close. And there were kids who committed suicide. There were kids who died of accidents, you know, kids who drowned, teachers who died of AIDS-related illness. You know, that was present. I go back even further than that, and remember when my grandmother died, and she was in another country, and we had a funeral service with a coffin. And I thought, but there's nobody in there. How do we do this? But still, it was important, but it was just, again, awkward. How do you do? I don't know. This doesn't make any sense to me. I have to touch them. It was one of the things that I also realized when one of my friends died in high school, and I didn't touch. I had a really hard time for probably a week realizing that she had actually died, that she wasn't there anymore. And then if I go back before that, you know, I had an aunt who died when I was about 3 or 4 or 6. You know, memory is an interesting thing. And she gave me a stuffed toy, a little dog. And you know, I immigrated to Canada when I was 10, and it was one of the sacred things that I took with me. It was very important that I take this thing with me. That little stuffed dog is very old. I'm not going to tell you how old it is, but it's very old. And it's still in my office, because there's something about that. So even out of my awareness, there's still something that has made an impact. So there's probably times in your life where you have a knowing awareness when something made an impact. But I bet you if you go back, you can probably find some other times when it still impacted you without your awareness. Remember I said my mother's first child, Alexander, was born, and he died 3 days after. That had an impact on my family. It had an impact on the cosmology of what it meant for me not to now be the second born, but to be the third born. It had an impact on my mother, so much so that she actually didn't have a chance to go through the whole process of grief and continue her grieving until maybe 30 years after. Because back then, women were usually told, you're young, you can have another child. And she did, a year and a day. And that had an impact on my brother without even his awareness. It's probably more than what you asked for, but.
One of the things I've noticed is when you talk about death, or because I've had some experience with the people who are dying, family members, and sometimes the memories will come back, and I'll share them with people, and they'll turn around and go, well, why are we talking about such a morbid topic? Where I look and go, I'm talking about my ancestors, or I'm talking about an experience. And I go, well, I don't want to talk about it. It's morbid. How do you talk to people about that when you need to share something like this, but they're like, well, I don't want to talk about it. It's morbid.
So again, I think it addresses some of the, death ignorant, even in the way in which we care for people who are mourning. And, it's one of those things where we have this idea and maybe not in this group, but there's this notion that, you take 3 days off work, you do what you need to do, and if you have a particular religious background or you have a particular practice, then we have some parameters as to what that looks like, the ritual and the grieving process, and you should be done about a year or so, and if you're not, then there's a little concern about why you're not quite finished. And that's actually an old way of thinking. It's the medicalized, it's pathologizing your grief. And there are moments where a person is not able to function well because they haven't necessarily had the resources or maybe found their way and are having a difficult time. And they need some support in that. But I think in everyday conversations, it's not a thing that most people talk about. So what I have found that oftentimes works is that I ask people, I say, would it be okay if I share with you, and can you hold a space for me where I just share something about someone that has died? Would that be okay? And if they're not, then honor that as well, because they might not just be ready, but having the opportunity and asking could be the first step, right? We don't want to bombard people and sort of go, it's going to come to you, although I did it for you guys, but you came, so you kind of knew the topic. Right? But to be able to invite people and to everyone's in their own place of how they're accepting of their own death or the death of anybody else, and just to hold people in that way, I think is a really good start. And then for those people that are, or even for those people that you're able to hold a space, is to give them that same advice maybe, and then they can start having those conversations or start a death cafe. Most people who come to a death cafe love talking about death in all forms, afterlives. I mean, amazing stories that I've heard, right? Amazing stories of dying, coming back, or, shocking things. And I tell people, I want to be fully conscious when I die. And they're like, oh my gosh, really? I say, yeah. Just to be able to start without sort of impacting negatively or without. And believe me, I want to shake the world and say, we need to talk about this. But you have to do it in such a way that it gives a person the space to do it. It's the same with the dying. I have had friends and I would always ask, I have to be invited. Just because I know and I have knowledge doesn't mean that it's a given that I can support you. Invite me and I will come. Right? I will do that. Okay, one more I think. So I'll need to prep for my acting debut as well.
So thank you very much for your talk. Deeply appreciate it. The one thing that I'm wondering about is, and I think is missing from the discussion, is different perspectives from a multicultural perspective, and perhaps us being in more of a Western civilization, perhaps a more Eastern perspective on things.
So I have studied in different paths and know of different expressions of rituals and how to be with dying from different cultures. And some to the extreme. There are certain cultures in the world where when a person of the community dies, they actually take the body home. They wash them every day and they dress them and they form a relationship with them within their dead physical form for sometimes up to a year, up to a time when the community has an opportunity to be, and the family has an opportunity to engage in a ceremony where they actually elevate the person to the ancestor shrine. And only then are they sort of released after they have formed those relationships. So there are many, many ways. If you're wondering and curious, again, go back to thanatology. Thanatology oftentimes teaches all of those different components. And they teach some of the principles of the death rites and what to do, how to prepare, what to do at the time of death, what to do after, and some of the taboos and some of the reasons why and those kinds of things. I think in our time, we're sort of blending and mixing things. One of my research papers that I did when I was doing my master's was, I asked the question, how do folks who come from Sikh and Hindu communities, how do they create ritual around the death and dying when they don't have the Ganges and they don't have the fire pyre? How do they do that? You know, it's a very different physical manifestation. How can they potentially be able to do that in the Western world?
And that would be part of my question as well, is how to integrate that into our Western society and the systems that we already have.
And there were communities that I did interviews with, and that I, went to a funeral and was there. And they have the ability to be able to be adapt, that they can still enable the eldest son to be able to press the fire of the retort that enables the fire to start where they have in the crematorium, where they have that ability to do that. That we as humans have an ability through our imagination and our curiosities to still hold the fundamentals of that ritual and create it. There are again, my understanding and my perception is that all rituals and traditions might have a line of thread to the time where it began, but they all shape and shift, and there have been times through history that certain knowledge was taken underground, protected because it wasn't the right time. And then at another time merged out where more people, even the people who didn't have the original knowledge, were able to gain that knowledge. That's very much of what's happened with the East influence coming into the West. And I would say maybe it's a way to be able to balance the two. We're not just all about the physical. There is a spirit component that needs to come from very much of what the East has brought. There is a component that comes from the First Nations people, which is all about heart and about feeling and about wounding and about how to heal. You talk about histories. And there are those components that come from the North, from the Celtics and from the celebrations from science and philosophies and all of those things that can come into the center and be able to create the milieu of where we are. So you can have a death and dying ritual that honors somebody who has the Jewish traditions and holds Shiva, and at the same time they are burning smudge and offering song and using the drum. And it's quite beautiful when that happens, when you bring all those things together. And I think more than, again, it's my opinion, more than anything else, death and dying ritual have that ability to be able to blend those things together, because all traditions, even atheists, have a way that they are with death that can be brought together. I can provide a space for someone who doesn't believe in an afterlife. Of course I can. In their human experience, in me holding a space for them to tell their story of their human experience, to hold that. Because for them, there isn't anything after that. Okay. And I don't even know if there is anything after that. I don't know. But I'm going to be here and do what I can while I'm here. And if there's anything after that, great. Maybe I'll do more stuff there. I don't know.
Welcome there of all the people that come in.
I know, come on.
Okay, well, thank you so
Thank you.
much. Very quick last question. What's a death cafe?
Oh. I don't know. So a death cafe that actually started, I believe, in Britain, in the UK, and I can tell you more information. I don't have it on my forefront, but it is really about an informal way of gathering people together and just talking about death, just really allowing natural conversation. So whether it's at a dinner party that you have and you say, you know what, come on over, we're going to have some Thai food and talk about death, or whether it's people having cake and coffee and tea. I think the intent is to normalize death, to be able to bring it back into everyday conversation so that people are not in denial or ignorant to the fact that It's here.
I don't want to talk about it, it's more.
There actually is a Facebook group called the Death Cafe.
Yep.
Okay,
It's actually very.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Yay. Awesome.